two numbers stand between normal operation and an emergency shutdown on the C175's lubrication system, 30 and 20. Welcome to this explainer of the C175 source material, everyone. Today, we're bringing some serious energy to a genuinely high-stakes topic, which is the critical pressure thresholds and diagnostic oil analysis of the C175 engine platform. We are going to break down exactly what happens inside that lubrication system when things get tense, and more importantly, how you can stay ahead of catastrophic failures. If you work with the C175, consider this the absolute essential survival guide for your engine's oil system. Let's jump in.
Okay, 30 and 20. They sound like two completely unassuming numbers, right? But on the C175 platform, these are the absolute critical PSI limits standing between a healthy, humming engine and a sudden emergency shutdown. Every single operator and technician needs to have these two numbers memorized cold. Honestly, by the time you're reading these numbers off a monitor during a live event, it is way too late to go hunting through a service manual.
Listen, what we're dealing with here is a stark, two-tier pressure defense system. On one side, 30 psi is your low pressure warning. In plain language, this is the engine looking at you and saying, hey, pay attention and respond right now. On the other side, you hit 20 psi. That's your critical low pressure shutdown. At 20 psi, the engine literally takes the control out of your hands and stops itself. Why? Because 20 psi is the hard, uncompromising limit where keeping that engine running risks direct, catastrophic mechanical damage to your bearings and other lubricated surfaces. A single threshold just wouldn't work here. It would either shut the engine down constantly with nuisance trips or act way too late to actually save the hardware.
So let's do a quick mental exercise. Picture this. You're in the facility. The engine is running perfectly under load. Suddenly, that oil pressure gauge drops and sits right at 30 psi. The low pressure warning starts flashing. What is your gut reaction? Do you hold off, kind of hover your hand over the phone and wait to see if it drops down to that 20 psi shutdown limit? Or do you call it in and take action right that second? Commit to an answer in your head right now.
Well, if you said wait, you've just made a very, very expensive mistake. The only correct answer is to act immediately. That 30 psi warning doesn't exist to be a casual suggestion. It exists specifically to give you a response window before the engine reaches its 20 psi critical shutdown threshold. If you treat that 30 psi warning as a let's wait and see situation, you are completely wasting the exact window of time the engineers designed to save your engine.
What's absolutely fascinating is how the engine's electronic control module, the ECM, actually manages these limits. While 30 and 20 psi are quick operator rules of thumb, the ECM is highly intelligent. It's actively monitoring precise pressure thresholds in kilopascals across varying engine speeds. The warning and shutdown strategies are actually a dynamic combination of engine RPM and filtered oil pressure. At 0 or even 500 RPM, it's not throwing warnings. But once you hit 600, 1200, all the way up to 2000 RPM, the ECM calculates exactly when to trigger that warning or when to command a hard shutdown to protect the system. It's a brilliantly proactive defense.
Moving right along to Section 1, proactive defense through SOS sampling.
Up until now, we've talked about the reactive crisis of pressure drops. But really, we want to avoid ever getting to that point, right? That's where proactive control comes in. We use dedicated hardware for this, specifically the SOS fluid sampling bottle and the engine sampling valve. The procedures emphasize using this dedicated valve for a very good reason. It guarantees you are pulling fluid that is actually flowing under pressure during normal operation. You completely avoid contamination from dirty drain pans or generic suction tools, which would completely skew your interpretation of the engine's health. So let's clearly define what SOS, or scheduled oil sampling, actually is. It's the process of obtaining oil samples directly from that dedicated sampling valve while the engine is warm. I really need to stress this point. SOS is not just some regulatory compliance checkbox to keep management happy. It is a literal window into the internal condition of your engine. It lets you catch developing internal wear long before it ever causes a pressure drop on your ECM gauge. Okay, time to bust a massive misconception that completely ruins diagnostic data: sampling from a cold engine. A cold engine sample is, practically speaking, functionally useless. Think about it. When the oil is cold, the waste particles and the tiny wear metals just settle right down to the bottom of the oil pan. If you pull cold oil, it's gonna look deceptively clean, giving you a totally misleading result. You absolutely must take the sample when the engine is warm and running at operating temperature. That is when the oil viscosity is correct, and, crucially, all those contaminants and wear particles are actively suspended in the fluid. That's the only way to get a true read.
But here's the real kicker. Even a perfectly accurate sample isn't enough on its own. The insight a lot of people miss is that oil analysis is not a simple pass or fail test. It is a trend tool. Think about going to the doctor to track your blood pressure. If your doctor checks it once while you're standing up, and then 6 months later while you're lying down, comparing those two random isolated readings tells you absolutely nothing. But if the doctor tracks it under identical conditions over several years, that consistent trend reveals your actual health trajectory. The exact same logic applies to the C715. A slowly rising wear metal trend across several consistent samples is a massive red flag. For instance, a facility that properly trends SOS data every 300 hours can catch a developing bearing wear issue 3 or 4 samples before it would ever trigger a pressure drop. You are literally turning an unplanned catastrophic failure into a planned manageable repair.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 2, the playbook, looking at service intervals by application. Simply put, how you use the engine completely dictates how you maintain it. There are drastic differences between a standby application and a prime application. While your SOS sampling sits at a consistent 300 hours for both, look at how the engine oil and filter intervals shift. A prime application running constantly gets a change at 600 hours, but a standby application, that's 500 hours or 1 year. The valve last check is 4,400 hours for standby, but slashed in half to 1,200 hours for prime. You absolutely cannot take a prime power schedule and apply it to a standby unit just because the engine model is the same. They accumulate wear and contamination in fundamentally different ways. And there's a golden rule I want to highlight here. For standby applications, you always apply whichever limit comes first, the operating hours or the 1-year calendar limit. See, standby units might sit around for months, accumulating barely any run hours, but that oil, it is still aging. It's still facing contamination, condensation, and chemical breakdown just by sitting there over calendar time. Even if you only fired it up for 50 hours this entire year, when that 1-year mark hits, you change the oil and the filter. Period.
All right, let's wrap this up with Section 3, your diagnostic next steps. So, what do you do when things actually go sideways and a sensor trips? When you're in the software investigating a low oil pressure event, you have to understand the critical difference between active codes and logged codes. Active codes tell you what is actively malfunctioning right now, in this exact second. But let's say an operator reports an intermittent pressure warning. You show up, the gauge is perfectly normal, and there are no active codes. Is your job done? Absolutely not. You must check the logged codes. Logged codes record what has gone wrong before. An intermittent fault might clear itself as an active code, but the ECM remembers it. It logs it. That log is your breadcrumb trail to track down and fix the issue before it turns into a permanent 20 psi shutdown. Let's bring all of this together. You are now equipped with the ultimate from crisis to control playbook. Number 1, you know to respond immediately to a 30 psi warning because it is your one and only window to act. Number 2, you know 20 psi is the hard, catastrophic shutdown limit designed to save the bearings. Number 3, always take your SOS samples from a warm engine so those wear particles are actually suspended. Number 4, treat those samples as a trend, not a simple pass or fail grade. And finally, number 5, strictly follow the specific intervals for prime versus standby applications. Never mix those two up.
I'm going to leave you with a final thought to take back to the facility today. When that gauge inevitably drops and the yellow warning light flashes, will you treat your next 30 psi warning as just a casual suggestion, or will you recognize it as your final, closing window to save the engine? The choice between some planned maintenance and a catastrophic, massive rebuild is entirely in your hands. So across the series, we've now covered mechanical structure, thermal management, fuel delivery, and today, lubrication for this platform. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.